Hi, this is Josh Haftel, and in this video we're going to be talking about the effects and details sections found inside of the all-new Lightroom CC. Let's get right into it. I'm going to open up this image, double click on it, and it's a picture of a Coco taxi, which is one of the many fun ways of getting around inside of Havana, Cuba. This one is basically a little taxi based off of I guess a motorcycle, looks like a coconut, but really, really fun, and I like the look and feel of it and the whimsy of it, so I took a photo of it. And I want to use now the effects and details to refine the look and feel of this image in particular. So let's start off with the effects section. There's a couple different tools inside of here that allow you to refine the style. So the first two, Clarity and D Haze, are kind of similar but really different at the same time. Clarity is all about bringing out like textures and details inside of the image in a way that you would use to really add some punch to the photo. And D Haze was originally designed, and it's still designed, to basically go into images that have haze or fog and remove that. But it's also something that a lot of photographers use on a lot of their images, even if there isn't any haze. And this is one of those images. So for example, if I go in here and just to give you an idea of the range of possibilities, I'm going to start with D Haze though. And if you drag it to the left, you see that it actually adds haze. So it makes the image kind of hazy, and it might be interesting in some images where you want to make a little mystery or intrigue inside of it. But one of the things that you'll see is as you start to drag that slider over to the right, you can see this is without D Haze, this is with D Haze. It's adding some interesting kinds of contrast to different parts of the image, and it's a kind of magical tool that's really, really hard to describe, but you start to get a feel for it when you play with it on a lot of your images. I know a lot of people that just end up putting like 20 D Haze on all of their photos just because they love the punch that it gives them. The clarity, on the other hand, adds in a lot more of this like texture. So if I zoom in on areas of the image that's got some texture inside of it, as I drag it over, you start to get that feeling of crispness in the image, and it's affecting the shapes and the texture inside of the image. And you can see, like, for example, the Havana Club sign over here, it starts to have a little bit more, we call it Midtone Contrast, because it just adds contrast just in the midtones. But again, another one of these hard to describe verbally, but really useful tools. And you can see as we add in this effect, it's starting to look really good. The next one in the effects area is actually the vignette. And the vignette, pretty obvious what happens when you drag the vignette to the left. It adds a vignette around the image, and you can do a white vignette. But this is a new way of approaching some of our tools that we've introduced inside of Lightroom CC, which is the ability to expand out and have control over additional levels of detail. So if you drag this top level slider down, that's going to affect the overall amount of the vignette, but then we can actually control the feather. And so you can see that the feather is doing, all the way to the left, it makes a very, very sharp vignette. And all the way to the right, it's a very, very smooth and soft vignette. And you can control that as you want. So if you want to make the vignette really obvious, you can just drag that to the left. Or if you want to make the vignette really, really smooth and subtle, you can drag it to the right. And I personally prefer the kind of smooth vignettes, so I'll use the feather to the right. And now the midpoint will actually decide how far out the vignette will start, and so we can drag that around to see how that works. And one thing that's really easy to see is if I drag the feather over to the left, you actually get an even easier way to understand what the controls are doing. Same thing with the roundness. So the roundness obviously is making it really, really round if you want it to be round, or if you wanted to make it more oblong. But then you go back over here, take that vignette over, and we take the midpoint and we play around with it. And this is, again, you do it to taste. And for the highlights, what the highlights usually do is if you've got some really, really bright areas around the edges of the image, you can drag that highlight slider over to the right, and it will try to bring back some of those highlights in case the vignette has darkened them too much. But because I don't have any of those bright highlights on this particular image, it's not going to do much. So we're going to just skip that one here. So now that I've got the effects kind of dialed in, and if you want to see what I've done, I'll just hold the Option key down, or the Alt key on Windows, and if you click on Reset Effects, and you can see with and without the effects. So that's without the effects. I'll do Command Z to reapply all those effects, and then Shift Command Z and Command Z will toggle back and forth between those two states to just give you an idea of what it is that I've done just using the effects. And that gives me an idea, like I'm adding in a little bit of this stylization on playing around with some of the contrast in a more creative way. Of course, you can still use all the other tools and open up the shadows and play with the vibrance. And I find myself a lot of times bouncing back and forth between the different tools. And that's one of the great things about using Lightroom CC is the ability to play with all the tools to your heart's content in any order that makes sense. And you can just affect the area that makes sense to you wherever it feels right at that time. So let's move on though. Let's go to the detail section. In the detail section, we've got a couple of things. We got sharpening, we got color noise reduction, we got noise reduction and grain. Now, sharpening is going to be something where if I exaggerate this, just give you a real good idea of what's happening. Take a look especially, and I can actually zoom in one level more to really, really drive it home what this is doing. As I take this sharpening over to the right, it's going to start really like cranking up the very, very, very small details. And now we're really bringing out some of the noise in the image and really bringing out some of the texture of little objects in the image. And you'd never really want to drag the sharpening all the way over to the right. But without putting the sharpening on it, this is with sharpening turned off, actually the image looks a little fuzzy or a little out of focus. So some sharpening is always good, and the default setting of 25 is what happens on all images inside of Lightroom CC. But if we want to go in and we want to like tweak it a little bit more, we can do that. Of course, the other thing you can do is we can actually expand that out. And now we can see some of these really, really detailed stuff. So now we've got the effects. We're going to go into the detail section. And to do that, usually what I'll do is I will zoom in to the 1:1 just to take a look at the details inside of the image as I start moving the sharpening. In the default mode, you have the sharpening area to see the disclosure triangle, which is closed. You can see that you can open it up. The top slider will affect the sharpening. Now, it's kind of hard to see it sometimes on some images unless you zoom in, especially if you're watching this on different display devices. So just to identify really what's happening, we'll zoom in a lot. And I did that with the Command plus or Control plus to get beyond the 1:1. And so you can see now as I drag that slider over, it's really, really like making it super crunchy, and it's adding in detail, and it's sharpening up all these little details. It's making the noise stand out even more. So this is something that's kind of fun to do with your images if you want to bring out some texture or bring out some detail. So different than clarity, where clarity is working at a larger scale, the sharpening is working at a much smaller scale, and it's going to work to bring out smaller levels of detail. And it gives you that feeling of when the sharpening is turned up a little bit, brings some areas that might be a little bit out of focus, make it feel like they're in focus. It also gives you that ability to accentuate certain textures or smaller textures. And you can actually go in and play around with those sliders a little bit to see the effect. The next one, the radius, is going to control like exactly how big of an object is it going to work on. Is it going to work on really, really small, like fine details, like with a small radius where it's going to really accentuate fine lines? Or if you drag that radius slider over to the right, it starts to affect larger and larger areas. So it's not going to be picking up small details like noise, but it is going to make other areas look a little bit different. So if you play around with it, it's definitely something you would want to affect from a trial and error perspective. Your detail slider is going to also try and focus in on the fine details. So as I drag that slider over to the right, you can see that it really brings out a lot of details. So I'm really over exaggerating it right now. So obviously if you move the detail and the sharpening over to the right, it is going to pick those up. So the detail slider is really useful, especially if you're using a larger radius and you also want to bring out the fine details. That's where the detail slider comes into play. And then finally, the masking, what that's going to try and do is it's going to try and focus the sharpening only on the areas with a lot of information in them. So that means like smooth areas, the more you move that slider over to the right, the masking slider to the right, the less of a sharpening effect it's going to apply to smooth areas. So that helps you avoid the look of noisy images. So that's something that's really useful. Now we've got some sharpening applied, and we can take a look at noise reduction. Noise reduction and color noise reduction, they're really useful for helping to get rid of that little grainy effect that comes in from digital images. We'll show you on a different image because this image doesn't have that much grain because it was shot in the middle of the day on a very low ISO. But the other thing you can see is we've got also a grain control that if you want to simulate the look and feel of old-timey effects, you can do that, like the film days. So you can bring the grain over here. You can affect the size of the grain. You can see as we drag the slider over, you can see that the grain size gets bigger or smaller. And I can also affect the roughness of that grain. So if I want the grain to be really, really smooth, I can drag it all the way over to the left. And if I want the grain to be really, really like random and rough, I can drag it over to the right. And we can just play around with it until it looks good. I personally love the fact that we shoot in digital, so I never put grain on my images, but if you like grain, enjoy. So let's take another photo though and see what the noise reduction can do for it. Let's pick a photo that was shot at nighttime. How about this guy over here? So let's zoom in here and let's take a look at the noise in the image. So I'm gonna go again, another zoom in one more step, and you can see this looks like grain. Actually, that's not from grain. That was actually shot by the camera. And that's that little randomness that happens when you shoot at nighttime. If I start to brighten up the image and add contrast to it, the grain becomes even more visible. And maybe you don't want that effect. Maybe you just want to have like a nice smooth effect in the sky. And that's where noise reduction comes in. So if I drag this noise reduction slider over to the right, what you start to see is that it actually starts to smooth out that effect. So if you don't want to have that noisiness in the image, you can drag that noise reduction over to the right, and I'll zoom in 1:1. But one of the things that might happen is if you start moving that slider too much, it might make the image look a little too soft or even too plasticky. So that's one of the cool things you have if you expand out this area. You have a couple of options to be able to go in there and bring back some detail, maybe even adjust the exact amount of noise reduction you want to do. And you can even play off the sharpening if you want to figure out how the balance between the sharpening that's being applied and the noise reduction in the image. And then the next one is color noise reduction. There's not too much we want to do with color noise reduction on this particular image because it's pretty good at the default setting. If you turn that off, you'll even see what the color noise looks like, and you can see it looks like little red, green, and blue splotches on the image. But the default setting of 25 that comes in for all of these looks pretty good, so you don't have to worry about it too much. So that's the effects and details sections inside of Lightroom CC.